Hey everyone, it's Colin, how's it going? Out of the box, the Atari 5200 only offered pretty limited picture quality. This time, let's do a couple of mods that, honestly, this thing should have come with from the factory. The 5200 was released in 1982 as the follow-up to the highly successful Atari 2600. It's an 8-bit console with multiplayer support and color graphics, but like a number of other systems from the era, it had one major limitation. It only outputs its video and audio signal through an RF adapter. That doesn't offer very good picture quality and won't even work on some modern TVs. So I set out to do something about it on my own console. I picked up a small circuit board from a web store called Electronic Sentimentalities. It's capable of taking the video signal directly from one of the main graphics chips in the console and turning it into a standard composite or S-video signal. Compared to some of the other console mods I've done, this one didn't look too daunting, so I gathered my tools and got to work. The 5200 is pretty straightforward to take apart. It's just standard Phillips screws holding the casing together, then the top simply lifts off. The RF shielding needed to come out next. I opted to bend these tabs flat with a pair of pliers, then the top shield could be pried up. Some people decide not to put the shielding back on when they're done, and if that's the way you want to go, you can snip off those tabs instead to make removal faster. The mod board needs to have wires connected between it and several points on the 5200's PCB. The most important of these are 6 wires that tie into a chip called the GTIA. It's what supplies the video signal. The 5200 went through a few revisions during its manufacturing run. In some of these, this chip is soldered to the board, but in the case of my early model 4-port unit, it's socketed, which makes installation much simpler. I popped the chip out of its socket and bent some of the pins straight out, specifically 21 through 25 and also 31. These need to be isolated from the rest of the Atari's circuitry and only connect to the mod board, so bending them out like this will keep them from making contact with the socket when the chip's reinstalled. On the Atari Age forums, I found someone who posted a picture of their own installation, and I noticed they had used some pre-terminated jumper leads to make the connections. This is a really good idea, so I did the same thing. I soldered the pin of each wire to the mod board, then cut the bundle to length. But I ran into a snag. When I went to solder the wires to the pins on the chip, they weren't sticking very well. Turns out the leads I were using was made of copper-clad aluminum. That's a really cheap kind of wire that's difficult to solder. I ended up desoldering them and redoing these connections with some solid copper wire. Yeah, they're just the inner conductors from an Ethernet cable, but they worked well. I did go with the jumper leads for the power connection for the mod board because I could leave the pins in place on each end. The mod board works off of 5 volts, and I found a good spot on the 5200's PCB to source it. There are a couple of through holes that were filled with solder that I wicked out, then was able to solder in the wires. Next, I started to think about where to install the output jacks. Due to the 5200's design, there's really only 2 inconspicuous spots on the back. The entire middle section is just storage for the controllers. I decided to use the expansion port cover on the left side. The mod board kit I bought included some panel mount jacks, and I used tape to mark off the right size on my step drill bit. Then I put some more tape on the console and marked where the holes should go. These step bits work really nicely on plastic like this. They leave clean holes without any tear out. While I was at it, I also drilled one hole on the opposite side of the console's back panel. You'll see why in a little bit. Next, I installed the jacks and started wiring them up. The composite video jack was the easiest with only signal and ground wires. The S-Video jack offers a bit better quality because it offers separate Luma and Chroma signals. basically the visual information and the color. It needs 4 wires, but 2 of them are grounds. On to the audio. That signal doesn't actually pass through the mod board at all. It gets picked up directly from the 5200's PCB. I soldered the positive wire to this leg of the resistor at R50, then the negative wire to R14. The 5200 only offers mono sound, but it's not a bad idea to have 2 jacks on the back so you can use regular AV cables and get sound out of both speakers on your TV. I bent the ground tabs and aligned them back to back so when I soldered in the ground wire, it could loop through both. On the end of the positive wire, I soldered the positive side of a 1 microfarad capacitor included with the kit. The negative side of the cap went to the center pin of the left audio jack. Then I slipped a small piece of heat shrink tubing over the part that stuck out and bent it over to the right audio jack. Doing it this way ended up being much simpler than dealing with a small jumper wire. But there was one more thing I needed to do, and that was to install a normal power input socket on the back. This part's optional and it's not included with the AV mod kit, but I decided to do it while I was in the console anyway. The Atari 5200 had an interesting one-cable design where both the RF signal and the power ran through this coaxial cable. It's permanently attached to the system and it's really annoying, so I desoldered it from the board and threw it in the trash. I also removed 2 other parts from the same area, the big electrolytic capacitor and the inductor next to it. As a side note, here's a good example of why it pays to use high-quality capacitors. This cap is original to the system, so it dates back to at least 1982. It's made by Elna, a well-regarded Japanese parts manufacturer, and it doesn't show any signs of leaking. There are caps and products made today that'll barely last 5 years, but this one is coming up on 40. In its place, I soldered in a smaller 47 microfarad cap. To the positive side, I soldered a diode in line with the wire. This is optional since it's meant to provide reverse polarity protection. Basically, if you plug in a power brick that's wired up backwards, it won't fry the system. But I think it's a good idea anyway. I soldered a small 0.1 microfarad ceramic cap between the 2 legs of the DC input jack, then attached the power wires to the jack so it was set up as center positive. All that was left then was to just install the jack in the back of the casing, and finally put the console back together and see if it worked. The image quality from this mod is great. Over composite video, everything looks really clean with minimal noise. There's a bit of color fringing, but it's not bad at all. And if you have a TV that supports S-Video, the quality looks even better. Everything just comes across a bit sharper. Thankfully, I didn't seem to have any problems with interference affecting the picture quality. If I did, switching over to shielded wiring between the mod board and the output jacks would likely fix it. Now, I'd love to show a before and after comparison, but I can't. And that's related to one of the reasons why I did the power mod. The 5200 needs a separate switch box to provide the connections for RF to the TV and power in from the AC adapter. But the switch box for this console was missing. Now, I could have gone out and just bought a replacement switch box off of eBay, and in most cases, that's the route I'd normally take. I remember playing this very console at my grandparents' house when I was a kid, and generally I don't modify things that I have a sentimental attachment to. But strangely, I don't feel that way about this one. Maybe it's because I was never all that crazy about Atari to begin with, and especially not the 5200 in particular. It wasn't compatible with 2600 games without an adapter, and the controller is, frankly, hot garbage, even at 1982 standards. And back then, consumers generally felt the same way about it. It wouldn't play Atari Computer System games despite being electrically very similar to them, and its native titles were generally perceived simply as being updates to existing games. Only about 1 million 5200s were ever sold, dramatically fewer than the over 30 million the Atari 2600 managed to sell. It was discontinued in 1984 with the unveiling of the Atari 7800, only 2 years after it had launched. I paid about $40 US for the video mod kit, and the parts for the power mod were really cheap, just a few bucks. And ultimately, this was all pretty easy to install. Now, if the chips in your 5200 are soldered in place instead of socketed, there are still a few options, and the instructions at the Electronic Sentimentalities site goes over them. I'll include a link in the description. With all that in mind, do these mods make it worth picking up an Atari 5200 and getting into its games? Probably not, but if you already have one, this mod kit is a great way to fix at least one of its biggest flaws. If you liked the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ThisDoesNotComp, and as always, thanks for watching.